I grew up listening to the legendary radio broadcaster Paul Harvey. Harvey's quick wit, plain-spoken style, and conservative views made him a favorite of listeners all over America. So it was a real treat a few years ago when I was allowed to be part of a group of journalists who interviewed Mr. Harvey before a speaking engagement right here in Rapid City. In response to our questions, the radio legend told of his personal journey toward a life-changing relationship with Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. When it came my turn to ask a question, I asked about a story he used to tell every December in his last news broadcast before Christmas Day. I asked why he told that story, and he replied in his characteristic style, "I just think that it might help reach some of the unreached." Well, today, in memory of the great communicator and in honor of the greatest communication of God to mankind, I want to share Paul Harvey's Christmas story of the man and the birds. You know, the Christmas story, the God born a man in a manger and all that, escapes some moderns, mostly I think because we seek complex answers to our questions, and this one is so utterly simple. And so for the cynics and the skeptics and the unconvinced, I submit a modern parable. Now, the man to whom I'm going to introduce you was not a Scrooge. He was a kind, decent, mostly good man, generous to his family and upright in his dealings with other men, but he just couldn't believe that incarnation stuff the churches proclaim at Christmas time. He couldn't swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. "I'm truly sorry to stress you," he told his wife, "but I'm not going to church with you this Christmas Eve." He said he'd feel like a hypocrite, that he'd much rather just stay at home. And so he stayed, and they went to the midnight service. Shortly after the family drove away in the car, snow began to fall, and he stood there at the window watching the flurries growing heavier and heavier, and then went back to his fireside chair and began to read his newspaper. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound, and then another, sort of a thump or a thud. At first he thought someone must be throwing snowballs against his living room window, but when he went to the front door to investigate, he found a flock of birds huddled miserably in the snow. They'd been caught in the storm and in a desperate search for shelter had tried to fly through his large landscape window. Well, he couldn't just let the creatures lie there and freeze, and so he remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. It would provide a warm shelter if he could direct the birds to it. And so, quickly putting on a coat and galoshes, he tramped through the deepening snow to the barn and opened the doors wide and turned on a light. But the birds would not go in. He figured food would entice them, so he went back to the house and fetched breadcrumbs and sprinkled them on the snow, making a trail to the yellow-lighted, wide-open doorway of the barn, but the birds ignored the breadcrumbs and continued to flop around helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them, he tried shooing them into the barn, walking around them, waving his arms, but the birds only scattered in every direction because they feared him. And it was then that he realized that they were afraid of him, that to them, he reasoned, I am a strange and terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me, that I'm not here to hurt them, but to help them. But how? Because every move he made tended to frighten them, confuse them. The birds simply would not follow. They would not be led or shooed because they feared him. If only I could be a bird, he thought to himself, and mingle with them and speak their language. Then I could tell them not to be afraid. Then I could show them the way to the safe, warm barn. But then I would have to be one of them, so that they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring, and he stood there listening to the bells and Adeste Fidelis. Listening to the bells, pealing the glad tidings of Christmas. And he sank to his knees in the snow.